Sup, people? I'm super excited to drop my first interview and guest on the pod. In keeping with my trailer and intro episode, I decided to invite Matt McManus on to revisit Michael Brooks' impact on left-wing thought, their mutual work debunking the new right, and their ideas on the next left or cosmopolitan socialism. Needless to say, we had a vast and sweeping conversation on how Matt got involved in left-wing politics, started publishing in various online media outlets, befriended Ben Burgess, and became a zero-book author, which eventually led him to collaborate online with Michael before his unfortunate and untimely death. In preparation for my conversation with Matt, I went back and reviewed roughly 13 of his online articles that I thought were very inspiring, constructive, and illuminating in where the left might go next. I'll post them in the show notes and would love to hear people's reflections and thoughts on them. In short, and no particular order, some of the subjects we touch upon are Richard Rorty, Cornel West, Roberto Unger, Martin Heidegger, Soren Kierkegaard, Paul Tillich, Jürgen Habermas, Slavoj Zizek, modern Buddhism, the religious left, Christian socialism, postmodern conservatism, Christian fundamentalism, and some of the differences between Canadian and American political theory and philosophy. All subjects I plan on doing deep dives on eventually, and hopefully have him back on to explore along with many other guests. Finally, make sure you all keep an eye out for Matt's other work in the pipeline, but for now I'd like to plug his upcoming book, A How-To Guide to Cosmopolitan Socialism, dedicated to Michael Brooks, which will be released later this year. So cheers, and I hope you all enjoyed the conversation. Sweet. Well, thanks for coming on, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, Michael had a big influence on a lot of us, right? And he was a really inspiring figure that way. And I think for a lot of people, he was their gateway to more radical kinds of politics, in part because he was very warm and personable, and in part because he had a real gift for making complicated ideas and complicated geopolitical situations accessible to ordinary people, right?
No, for sure, yeah.
Everyone else, for that matter, as well. Right?
No, and I guess that was kind of my question to you as a kind of kickoff question: is how did you discover Michael and get introduced to his work?
So I actually learned about Michael through Ben Burgess, right? Who, some people you might know, I partner with on a lot of different projects, right? So I knew that Ben was Michael's friend. I met Ben back in, I guess it would have been the summer of 2018. When I asked him to come and give a little talk to my class virtually at Tech de Monterey at the time. And then I looked him up and I noticed that he did a lot of different interviews and shows with Michael. And then I started kind of spending more time with him over the course of a couple of years. We actually only ever got to chat once, sadly, when I interviewed him for Zero Books about his book Against the Web and about this notion of cosmopolitan socialism that he was starting to develop. And it's really sad because I was hoping we were going to have a lot more conversations. He wasn't an old guy. He was very personable, really put you at ease when you're talking to him. And we had always talked about doing a little bit more together, writing something, who knows, right? And then, of course, he died, sadly, in 2020, very suddenly and unexpectedly. And to this day, I kind of regret the fact that we never got to do more things together, but his work was an inspiration to me, and I do cherish the fact that we got to have that chat.
No, for sure. Yeah. Well, obviously I saw, kind of the whole arc of your own kind of personal development, in terms of writing and, your kind of career kind of moving past your postdoc. So it's been really inspiring to go out and watch, as a fellow Canadian, see your writing develop and, and move into that sphere and start to influence, a lot of American discourse as well. So it's been really impressive. And so the cross, fertilization as well, and the connection with Michael has been really, for me, hopeful. Because what I got from Michael, essentially, like through your writing, obviously on the New Right, and then obviously discovering his work, his trajectory, his intellectual trajectory is very similar to mine. I mean, he grew up in a sort of kind of hippie type family background, yet, face quite a bit of family challenges, I guess, in terms of, one point or another, which is very similar to my own and stuff like that. But eventually he discovered Ken Wilber's work in integral theory. Mm-hmm. Which is, part of my own kind of, development, I guess you can say, kind of, before going to university and stuff like that. So seeing his trajectory through that and eventually parting ways with integral theory and the integral movement is something that I also experience, a sort of disenchantment and falling away from that. So, and when he eventually starts to talk about a new left or a new engaged left, if I go and start using your term, I saw a lot of synergy between both of your thinking there in terms of, where you guys were kind of moving towards this idea of cosmopolitan socialism. So I guess, to me, what are you thinking when you're, you're thinking about the new engaged left and cosmopolitan socialism, and where exactly does that kind of cross over with Michael's talk, you think?
Well, look, there were a lot of different areas where I was inspired by Michael, and where I inadvertently came to the same kind of conclusions as he did without encountering him, right? But I mean, I suppose there are three things that we can talk about, right? One is the idea that the left does need to think from a cosmopolitan perspective, and I think that there was this big temptation when I was going to school and when I was kind of getting involved in left circles to kind of stress particularism and trying to deal with things exclusively at the local level. And this was justified theoretically and practically as a kind of necessity if you wanted to be on the left. And, we can dive into some of those debates if you want. But I always thought that this was something of a mistake, in no small part because the systems that we're trying to challenge are global in their scope and ambitions and power, right? And I know that Michael agreed with a lot of that, right? He would always stress the fact that just because you want to focus on helping teachers in New York City get justice because they get a better union contract doesn't mean that you should be indifferent to what's going on in Brazil. He wrote a lot about Lula and the administration there. Doesn't mean you should suddenly think that what happens in Iraq, especially when the United States is involved there, doesn't matter to you at all. You need to kind of adopt this perspective. And that's something I've always been sympathetic to. The other thing that I've really liked about his work, still do, is again the fact that he was unafraid to engage with conservative thinkers very directly. As I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, Michael's first book was Against the Web, sadly his only book, political book, I should say. He had another one on spirituality. Was Against the Web, which was kind of a critique of the IDW, particularly people like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, more controversially Sam Harris, right? And he wasn't afraid of platforming them. He wasn't afraid of giving them undue attention. All these kind of arguments that people sometimes put forward for why we shouldn't engage the right. He just confidently said, look, our arguments are better. Their arguments are bad. And if it comes to an intellectual confrontation between us, we're the ones who are going to win because our ideas will prevail in the end, right? And that kind of optimism and confidence was something that I always found really appealing, right? And I think it's the position that we should adopt on the left when it comes to engaging with the right. And I suppose the last thing that he did that I really admired and still do is that he wasn't afraid to be personable when it came to how he talked to people, how he presented himself as a leftist. I think that there's this temptation sometimes to see ourselves as constantly under attack. And so needing to always put up this kind of armor of being confrontational, being antagonistic, acting like we're under siege. And, there are circumstances where that's appropriate. I'm not saying that we should be sunny ways, to use Trudeau's phrase, all the time, right? But the fact that he could come across just as an ordinary guy who liked to hang out, liked to talk about other things, had a diverse array of interests. Lordy had a diverse array of interests. And you felt like you got to know him when you were listening to him. All of that was something that we could use on the left. So aesthetically, I found a lot of the ways that he presented himself appealing. And personally, I just thought he seemed like a cool guy.
Yeah, no, I mean, for sure. I mean, that's what, once I started to listen to him and start to understand where he was coming from, and also, I guess, some of the same background in terms of some of the readings that he was doing, because exactly like you said, I mean, he did have a really broad sort of interest beyond just the political. I mean, he moved really into some aspects of the religious, which I think is really interesting and something that you've written about as well, in terms of some of your new writings. I mean, my own kind of background is actually in religious studies. Mm-hmm. So once I saw you starting to go and drop people like Kierkegaard and, obviously Cornel West as well, just like Michael and stuff like that, it drew me in even more in terms of, interest. So I guess this is the other thing too, because you don't talk about that very much, I guess, on some of the other pods that you go on, or even when you're talking with Burgess and stuff like that, in terms of, I guess, kind of the religious left, what the religious left could actually go out and bring, forward in this discourse as well. That Michael was not afraid to go out and lean into and be inspired by it.
Yeah, no, I should say here, Michael and I differ a little bit. Not in any kind of profound way, right? But Michael was always deeply attracted to East Asian forms of spirituality. He wrote about them quite consistently. And obviously, he brought a lot of that perspective to his outlook on life and his politics generally, right? And, I don't want to denigrate that in any way, shape, or form, right? It obviously contributed a great deal to his understanding of the world and his personal satisfaction. Now, the kind of approach that I take when it comes to religion and the left, just due to my background, is usually to fixate more on issues within Christianity, right? So at the moment, I'm a member of the Institute for Christian Socialism. I've written for them at several points, and I actually lead various discussion groups on Christian socialism for ICS, right? And the reason I choose to do that is just, it's my background, but also because politically, I think that at the moment we're seeing a point where various forms of Christian authoritarianism, particularly Catholic authoritarianism, are becoming increasingly intellectually ascended in the United States and elsewhere. Not just Catholic, I should say. You can also see East Orthodox variants of Christianity becoming increasingly muscular, as we can witness right now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? And all these things are deeply concerning to me. So I think that as leftists, we need to be able to respond to that by pointing out that this kind of authoritarian traditionalism that people associate with Christianity is deeply untrue to the underpinning message of Jesus and other Christian figures, and to restore the Christian left to pride of place in its pantheon by looking at people like Cornel West, Paul Tillich, Martin Luther King, who was actually wrote his doctoral thesis on Paul Tillich. And so that's been a project that's been a concern to me for quite some time. In addition
for
to
sure, yeah. No,
being more broadly interested in secularization.
Yeah, and I mean that's why your work just speaks to me. So clearly and so powerfully in terms of your writing, and particularly your stuff around, I guess, postmodern conservatism, and how there's a deep sort of regressive pull within postmodern conservatism that drives or kind of almost regresses back to some sort of fundamentalism. But Michael as well seemed to be quite critical, I guess, in terms of the kind of sort of mech mindfulness, whether it be from the East Asian type stuff, because obviously he gravitated much more towards Zizek. And I know Zizek has, laid some pretty devastating sort of critiques against a sort of fluffy spirituality. But like you, Michael seemed to have, much more critical approach to religion or what it could actually go out and bring. So that to me was definitely really super inspiring behind, seeing your writing and both of his writing. But the other thing too that I want to go and talk to you about is, I guess, your ideas of the engaged left, because you've written quite a few pieces on the new engaged left with Galen Watts over at Arrow Magazine, and I found those pieces to be super inspiring as well, and almost fall, in tandem with Michael's thinking in terms of cosmopolitan socialism. So I was curious to hear maybe kind of some of your thinking on that, and whether you see it, does it cross over? Does it breed into that same sort of thinking, or where exactly are you on that now?
Yeah, maybe I'll be a little bit autobiographical here because that helps explain where those articles came from. So the root of that article was actually because when I started kind of becoming public engaged, I wrote a number of pieces for Quillette Magazine. Right, for those of your listeners who don't know, Quillette Magazine is a pretty firmly IDW outlet. Now, the first of these was actually a piece on critical legal studies, which was the tradition I came out of from my doctoral studies. And I just thought that the author got CLS really wrong, right? They kind of written a caricature of it instead of a full critique. So I went in and I defended the piece, and I got a huge amount of angry emails from Quillette readers. But I also got a few emails from people who said, you know what, I actually think that maybe based upon your take on this, there might be more to this than I thought, right? Sometimes it was kind of a begrudging, like, even though I don't like it still, maybe you have a point here and there kind of attitude. But I was like, okay, it's a step, right? And so what I decided to do was to try to see if I could write for some of these conservative leaning outlets to pitch left-wing ideas to them and do that successfully in a way that they would understand, right? And maybe they wouldn't like it and maybe they wouldn't agree with it, but at least, I'd be getting the point across. And I did that for a little while. It had a fair bit of pushback against it from some people on the left who are concerned that I was kind of legitimating or platforming these outlets. And I appreciate those concerns. I think they were misguided, and they're misguided for the reasons that I explained in the article, right? Which is that I do believe that if you actually articulate a cogent argument for left-wing ideas, and you do so to an audience that will at least listen to you, you are more likely to win converts to your cause than to lose them, right? Because I ultimately think our ideas are the correct ones, and that there's an intellectual tenability to them that you don't see on the political right. So why not be muscular and assertive in trying to stand up for our positions in whatever kind of outlet, right? And I don't think that applies in all circumstances, right? I would never sit there and write for the Daily Storm or criticizing, Alfred Rosenberg or something like that, right? That'd be a step too far. But in these outlets where you're dealing with kind of moderate conservatives who are open, at least in principle, to being swayed, that's what I was hoping to achieve. And the Engaged Left piece was kind of a statement to that effect.
Which is very close to Richard Rorty. I mean, because Richard Rorty, in terms of some of his writing as well, I mean, he was very concerned about where the direction of the left was going, and that he almost seemed to be anticipating the vampire left through what he was, seeing coming forward, and that, he needed to go out and take a much more democratic or engaged piece. And I was wondering if you were inspired by Rorty in terms of when you were thinking about that or writing that, because Rorty's had a pretty deep impact on me.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about that. Right now, I should say that epistemologically, I don't agree with a lot of Rorty's standpoints. Right. So let's just get that off the table. But that book, Achieving Our Country, or the other book he wrote, Philosophy and Social Hope, both were deeply inspiring to me. Right. Because while I don't agree with the kind of anti-foundationalist liberalism or social liberalism that he argues for, I do think that achieving something like social liberalism in the United States would be a positive boon, not just for Americans, but for the world, right? And what I like is that Rorty was never afraid to argue for these positions in a very clear, precise, and down-to-earth kind of way, for the most part, right? And he would say things like, look, if we want to actually attract people to the left, this is from Achieving Our Country, why shouldn't we be doing things like they used to do in Dissent magazine, right? Arguing for universal healthcare, arguing for better access to education, particularly for racialized minorities, arguing that maybe American imperialism isn't the best thing, and that we should be trying to play a constructive and positive role in the world rather than exporting our viewpoints through the barrel of a gun, right? These very concrete kind of issues. And Rorty also said, look, the problem is that that's not what a lot of left-wing theorists do right now, right? What they prefer to do is engage in these kind of opaque cultural disputes about, is Derrida or Deleuze the way to go when it comes to doing literary analyses of War and Peace or whatever. And look, I'm not here to slam doing that because I think there's a place for it. And Rorty agreed that there was also. He pointed out that Fred Jameson's Postmodernity or the Cultural Logic of Capitalism was a brilliant book. And I agree, right? But you can't just be doing that exclusively. And I also think that he pointed out in the book that the fact that the left retreated to these kind of purely theoretical issues was kind of a retreat politically, right? An acknowledgement that we had ceded the public sphere to a kind of centrist conservatism and that there was no going back, right? I think that we shouldn't do that, right? I think we should try to claim the public sphere for our own and make left-wing views hegemonic wherever possible. I said that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but that's the idea. And I think he was correct that if we don't do that, then what we're going to see is people like Trump emerge, or Trump-ish figures emerge.
Yeah, and which he actually went out and highlighted even in his own book. He thought that's something that would be eventually vomited up in the Trump sort of fashion, kind of almost like Fukuyama.
I just want to say he was prophetic in that book, where about the middle of it, he says, if the left doesn't do this, then eventually conservatives are going to catch on that they should elect an authoritarian who goes and says that he's going to save them from all these woke scolds and put the liberal elites in their place, all while lowering taxes on the wealthy and butchering attempts to achieve racial and gender and sexual equality in the United States. And wouldn't you know it, about 20 years after he wrote that book, along comes Donald Trump. So I don't think you should usually buy into political prophecies because a lot of times people are wrong. But as it goes, Rorty was pretty on the number.
Right? Yeah, no, for sure. No, and I just love his idea of the next left in terms of, where the left needs to go next. So I draw inspiration from that, and I see you pushing very much in that direction, and I saw Michael pushing very much in that direction. So it gives me a lot of hope.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. I do.
I think it's fantastic. The other thing too is, since you do draw, like Michael had a lot of broad interests and stuff like that. The other piece that I sent you that I want to go and hear you talk about is Roberto Unger, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
Since you're critical of pragmatism, because Cornel West is, he could in some ways fall into the pragmatist sort of camp, and so could Unger, if I'm not mistaken. I was curious to hear, why you were pulling on Unger as a possible sort of left inspiration that people can go out and drop on, because his work is, it's pretty out of this world. So I was hoping to get a few of your thoughts and reflections on that, and if you still think that.
Sure. I should say I'm not opposed to pragmatism wholesale. When I'm opposed to the kind of hyper anti-foundationalist pragmatism that Richard Rorty put forward, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
I kind of label myself a cognitivist pragmatist. I think that we throw in a little Kant, a little bit of cognitive science, link that to semantic pragmatism, and we're more or less on the right track to where we got to go, right? So less kind of anti-foundationalist and radically skeptical as Rorty. But look, when it comes to the Unger point, I'll just be a little bit autobiographical again. I came to Unger, I guess in 2013 would have been where it was. And at the time I was doing my PhD at York University, really just starting actually. And our nickname for the school was Foucault U, right? It's a little unfair, but not entirely, right? So most of what I encountered was post-structuralist theory, right? And I have nothing really wrong with it. I have nothing bad to say about that. I think there are a lot of insights you can glean from Foucault. But after reading this stuff day in and day out and day in and day out, you kind of do adopt a pretty pessimistic view on life, right? That, well, reform is necessary, but probably impossible because power is just, ubiquitous, coercive and disciplinary forms of power. And you should try to overcome them, but you're probably going to fail, or you might even make things worse, right? That was kind of the takeaway I had at the time. I was in my early 20s, so it's pretty gloomy, right? And I wanted a kind of left-wing theory that was more constructive, more inspiring, and kind of offered a positive vision for the future. And that's what I found in Unger's work, right? Where he really laid out this vast, even epic kind of theory for how things could be changed. Gives it various different names over the course of his career: radical democracy, super liberalism, empowered liberalism, empowered democracy, right? There's different labels for it. But the fundamental essence of his work is this idea that we need to follow Marx in recognizing that human society is constructed by human beings, that it can be transformed in certain radical kinds of ways. And the idea that we've reached an end of history point where we've exhausted all the potential possibilities incumbent within human society and within human nature is just bogus. We can do a lot better than this. And his early work is all about trying to expose the false necessity that we live in a kind of settled society that can't be transformed, and to theorize on cracks in the social edifice that we can kind of lean into that will allow us to open up these new kinds of possibilities for human life. Mostly law, since he was a critical legal theorist, but he kind of branches into other areas as well. Okay.
Religion, in fact, too. Some of his other stuff. The one review, and I'm amazed as well in terms of all the stuff you've written for Merion West, but that one review in Merion West where you cover his work, that basically he moves into the transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary sort of approach that could lay some pretty big criticisms against you if you veer in there and you're not very skillful at it. But he veers in there and he's willing to go out and bring in religion or some sort of metaphysical thinking, or veer into stuff that most leftists would be quite questionable about, I guess.
Absolutely. There's no doubt that Unger was ever just going to become a legal theorist or even, a social critic, right? His panorama of interest was vast, seemingly inexhaustible. On top of the fact that, he's done all this work on religion and social theory and the philosophy of nature and time, he was also a minister in the Lula administration for a long period of time. So he's actually gotten pretty significant on-ground political experience, right? You want to talk about a life well lived or living an interesting life, right? But I think that his major recent contribution to left theory that actually has been under appreciated is this way of reconceiving the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of time. Probably his most important book in that respect is one that he co-authored with Lee Smolin. Lee Smolin, for those of you who don't know, works at the Perimeter Institute at the University of Waterloo. He's a theoretical physicist. And they co-authored a book called The Singular Universe and the Reality of Time. Right now, there are two ambitions in this book. One of them is arguing against M or multiple worlds theory, right? That I won't get into too much, unless people really are interested in it. But the way that Unger reconceptualizes time and nature, and Smolin, is really foundational. Because the argument that they make is that conservative scientists, rather like conservative individuals, are fixated on the idea that essentially the world is unchanging, right? That time is just the moving image of eternity, and nature and its laws remain constant. We just have to figure them out, right? And this obviously maps onto their vision of how the world should work, right? That more or less society should remain unchanging. The people at the bottom should remain at the bottom. People at the top should remain at the top, and nothing fundamental should alter, right? And there are natural laws for this. And Smolin and Unger argued that, in fact, it makes no sense to even talk about eternity, right? That eternity is a kind of antiquated metaphysical concept. Instead, we should simply talk about what he calls the reality of time, right? The fact that everything exists within time and is so constantly subject to change and transformation, right? And he gives an elaborate scientific and philosophical argument for that. And I think that's very interesting and very inspiring. Now, he's not doing this in a vacuum. You can find antecedents to this in the writings of people like Henri Bergson, for example, right, who's a big influence, or Gilles Deleuze and Philosophe Guattari. Except this work kind of systematizes this and gives it a lot more of a kind of hard scientific kind of basis and justification. So if people are really interested in looking at what I think his most foundational contribution will be, I really invite them to look at that book, which is magisterial in its ambitions and its execution.
Sweet. And I mean, that's what I find so inspiring too about your work and what Michael was doing as well, right? Is that you guys were not, or you're not afraid to go out and dive in there and start talking about these larger sort of not necessarily philosophical questions, but grounding them, in some sort of deep meaning, right? That there needs to be a conversation on the left around meaning and larger questions of life. That right now, that the right, or the new right, or postmodern conservatives, the way you've gone out and described, they're kind of going out and monopolizing. So what do you think we would need to do to go out and accomplish more of that, or start to push those types of narratives in different sorts of outlets? Because that's something that's not really prevalent. Something like a Jacobin, that's not, like necessarily the go-to spot that we go to. But somebody like Cornel West would go out and probably go out and veer into those types of conversations. And Michael was doing that. And I mean, in your writing, you seem to be doing that as well. What do you think we could do to start to push that a lot more?
Well, I think that a lot of what you're talking about is symptomatic of the neoliberal era, but in a very particular way, right? Because starting in the 1980s, what Wendy Brown calls left-wing melancholia became a very prevalent fact in radical spaces, where there was really this belief that the left had lost, right? We'd achieved all that we were going to, for the most part, right? There were still some struggles worth fighting. And so there's really no need for these kind of big picture analyses any longer, right? All that was really left to us was to achieve justice in very local and particular kind of circumstances, right? And again, I'm not trying to dismiss those efforts, and I think a lot of them have achieved a tremendous amount, right? Particularly the efforts to achieve sexual liberation for LGBTQ people, anti-imperialist and anti-colonial efforts, you name it, right? However, I do think that there was a mistake in assuming that there are no big struggles left to confront, right? Or that we can't improve the world for the better, right? And it seems increasingly like many people have adopted a very similar kind of perspective, right? And I think that's one of the reasons Michael's work became very popular. Or you can see the popularity of people like Wendy Brown, like Slavoj Žižek, right, who also offer these big picture analyses, right, intellectually.
But why do you frame it as a mistake, though? To me, it's almost like a question, like we've always been talking about this on the left. I mean, like I've been inspired by Habermas and by some of these thinkers as well. And I always feel that, like they just like, you're just not fully grasping or diving into the full depth of what the left has to offer. And that, like, I think it's kind of funny now that the new right or postmodern conservatives, that all of a sudden they're just catching up with the particularities of what postmodernism is. It's like, well, welcome to the club, guys. Like now we have a lot more to go and throw your way.
No, absolutely, right. Now, I'm not trying to be disdainful of left theory from that point. I mean, I read a lot of it and I still read a lot of it. And, I'm deeply inspired by it. What I'm talking more is about the kind of attitude towards social change that's reflected in the theory. And in the cactus that's inspired by the theory, right? Again, this idea that local struggles are really the only way that we can actually achieve justice, right? And that trying to give big picture structural analyses of society that incorporate something like a philosophy of nature, incorporate something like a philosophy of religion, that's not what we should be doing, right? Because there is this kind of radical skepticism that you see in various flavors of postmodern philosophy, right? And it's kind of offshoots. And again,
or just critical theory to core. I mean, critical theory falls into that like very cynical sort of framework eventually pretty quickly as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Now, I'm not saying that, we should never do that and that there's something intrinsically wrong with it, but I do think it has its serious limitations, particularly when it comes to the cultural moment that we're facing right now. And that's why I think it's a positive sign that people are gradually starting to move away from that towards more constructive, big picture ways of analyzing things, right? Now, how do we actually go about channeling these intellectual and cultural energies into movements for sincere political change through something like democratic socialist mobilization or mass efforts to try to confront neoliberalism? That's not where my specialization is. I'm kind of an academic and I'm not much of a political activist when it comes to on the ground stuff. I think that Megan Day and Micah Utrecht have written a great book on this subject called Bigger Than Bernie. And I have a review of that coming out for Ariel pretty soon. If people are interested, I'd recommend picking that up because I think that you're not going to find better analysis than what they provide. Right?
Sweet. Yeah, no, for sure. No, and I'm with you on that as well. I mean, like talking about things intellectually is not where, the rubber meets the road type idea. We need to be concrete and in terms of real social change and real impact on people's lives. And I mean, and Michael was great about that as well, right? I mean, he always went out and reframed it along those lines. How can we go out and have a massive impact for everybody? That's great.
Absolutely. I just want to intersect because this is something that's close to my heart, right? I think there are two temptations that we need to avoid, right? There's the Heideggerian temptation, right? That you still see some people on the left fall into, which holds that essentially ideas are what matter first and foremost. So if we win the battle of ideas, eventually we'll win the political confrontation, right? If Heidegger's conceit that the whole history of the West is really just the story of its metaphysics, and the battles are really carried out by the philosophers who become the mouthpieces for political movements before the political movements are even aware of it, right? This is a bit of a simplification, but yeah, there's this idea. And you do see people on the left sometimes adopt this view, and they inflate the importance of academic efforts and academic interventions for that reason. I've been at conferences where people will just get into shouting matches at each other over whether or not we should be Deleuzians or Hegelians. And you kind of think to yourself, like, wow, this might be a great interest to you. I don't know that it's really going to fucking shake the annals of the world, On the other hand, I do think that there can be an activist temptation to assume that ideas really don't matter at all. Right, that all we need is to get out there in the street to protest, to be angry, and things will change. And I think that is also wrong. And I think you saw expressions of why that's wrong throughout the course of the 1990s and the 2000s, where there were a lot of activist movements that tried to confront neoliberalism, try to confront the worst elements of globalization, try to confront Wall Street. You think about the Occupy Wall Street. But the fact that there wasn't a clear theoretical alternative, well worked out to what it was that we were criticizing, meant that a lot of times these gestures burned brightly for a little while and then they kind of fell away, right? And it wasn't really until you saw things like the Bernie Sanders campaign or the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that we really started pushing for different alternatives that had a kind of plausibility to ordinary people, right? And a lot of that has its roots in the fact that people started arguing for democratic socialism again, right? Are thinking about alternatives to the status quo. And that's where I think theory can play a vital role on top of doing what I do. And I like to think I play my own part, which is criticizing shitty ideas from the political right and trying to explain why ours are better. I think that's useful also. So everyone has a part to play in this. And we need to avoid the temptation to assume that we shouldn't be theorists or that we must be theorists at all costs, right? A little bit of both is what's needed. The Aristotelian mean.
No, for sure. Yeah. No, and I appreciate your segue into Heidegger as well, because that was another piece that I picked up on and that I sent your way that, you felt that and you pretty much summarized it, right there. That I mean, that progressives or leftists should take Heidegger seriously, but not go out and lead in with that type of sort of ontological sort of thinking and stuff like that. And I mean, I've been personally really influenced by Habermas, and I mean, Habermas really just kind of avoids the whole kind of ontological question altogether, and it's all about action in a certain way. Well, communication and action, and maybe he's
communicative action, right?
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. But I get, because this is the other thing too. I mean, because we've kind of gone back and forth a bit on Twitter and stuff like that, and I was wondering, like how you feel about Habermas today. Sort of along with Unger. I'd be curious to see, because the impression I got from you online is basically like you can't stand him, or you just feel that it's not particularly.
Not at all. I mean, I like Habermas a lot. I mean, look, it's a funny story, but this is just why I'm laughing, right? So, I thought that the guy had retired. I thought, well, he's done, because I was asking myself, like, when was the last time a Habermas book came out? I'm like, probably 2012 or something like that, right? And I thought, well, he's got to be, in his late 80s, well deserved, right? And then I found out that, and actually, I was kind of happy about this. This is the key point, because I was like, well, I've read most of his books now, and that's it. That's all I'll need to read. No more need to slog through these multi-volume epics. And then I found out that he's just published in German a 1,500-page history of philosophy that he's been working on for decades, and he calls his life's work. And I'm like, oh crap, back to the multi-volume work, I suppose, whenever it gets translated into English. And I thought, like, well, give the guy credit. He's been busy. He didn't just decide he's going to go sit in the Alps, drink a beer, and enjoy the scenery. He's been very, very, very proactive.
No, for sure. No, I was just slammed with Habermas. I mean, I joke around with friends and stuff like that. I mean, when two of my professors were, big time into his work and his influence on religion and how they, and theology as well. So I just got so, like, they literally threw it at me at left, right, and center. And it just put such a roadblock in front of me to go and try and wrestle with what was going on in religious studies at the time. That it just stuck. I mean, I can't stand reading him. He's a horrible read, and yes, I share it with other people just feel like, like, why the hell would I go out and read through that? It really is like ripping teeth.
Well, I've always found that the biggest problem I have with his writing is actually that he's almost too nice a guy. It's the same problem I have sometimes reading Rawls books. I love Rawls, and I like Habermas a lot, right? Because if there's any argument that's made against them, they have to deal with it at great length and as generously as possible, right? And you see that throughout all his books, right? Where so much of it is responding to critics fairly, patiently, systematically. And you really admire that, because he's kind of living up to his philosophy, right? Of dialogue, democratic discourse, trying to be as fair to the other side as possible. But as a reading exercise, you're just like, oh God, man, just get to the point, right? Tell me what you want, right? What's the idea that you're getting at here? Right? I appreciate that people have made these criticisms of communicative ethics. You seem to be really, I think you're probably right in that they didn't quite understand it, but like, just move on.
No, for sure. I guess this is,
I say that with love. If Habermas is listening to this, that's no disrespect. I also kind of came up reading a lot of his works. I still have a lot of admiration for him. I'm definitely going to pick up this too, another history of philosophy, or this too, a history of philosophy when it's translated, right? So, love to the guy.
Sure. No, yeah, for sure. And I guess because we're talking a lot about the left, but we're always talking about the American left. Mm-hmm. And as two Canadians, just kind of shooting the shit here. I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you think the Canadian left should be doing, or what Canadians should be doing in all of this, because this is something that we don't really strategize about or think about very much, I find, or particularly in the podcast sphere. Most of the time we just gravitate to what's going on south of the border. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, and what Canadian thinkers have really had an impact on your thinking and still do today.
Well, there've been a number of them, actually. So, I don't want to give you a list of all the kind of Canadian philosophers that I've been inspired by, but I do want to make a pitch for a very good book by Andrew Jackson, The Fire and the Ashes, Rekindling Democratic Socialism in Canada, should be the subtitle, right? Oh, cool. It just was recently published Jackson, for those of you who don't know, is a longtime member of the labor movement in Canada. He teaches on labor economics at an institution in Ontario. I can't quite remember, right? But he kind of chronicles his life on the Canadian left at great length and talks about what he thinks the NDP specifically should be doing for the future. So great book if you're interested in these kind of subject matters from a Canadian standpoint, strongly endorsed by me. And the reason I bring that up is because I actually agree with a lot of Jackson's points about the Canadian left, right? I think that we have a left party in Canada that has had viable electoral successes in the past, right? And that gives us kind of an edge in some senses over the United States, where there is no viable left party. We kind of have the DSA and the left wing of the Democratic Party, but neither of them has really gotten sufficient traction to change policy in the United States in a kind of viable way. Whereas here, we've had NDP governments before at the provincial level, never at the federal level, but came very close in 2011 to 2015, right? And one of the arguments that he makes is that we can take the NDP and try to push it in a more left direction, but we need to do so in a way that's cautious but ambitious along two fronts, right? One of those fronts is that we really need to commit the NDP to rebuilding the workers' movement in Canada, because he points out that just like in the United States, since the advent of the 1980s, we've seen just a shattering of the labor movement, understood very broadly in Canadian circles. It's never quite recovered, even under various Liberal governments. And unless you have that, it's going to be very difficult to have the civil society institutions that are necessary for broad-scale economic change. Now, how to go about doing that, he gives a bunch of different possibilities, and we can discuss them, right? But the other thing that he brings up that I think is actually a trickier ideological problem, where theory could actually play a role, is he points out that there's a substantial divide in some places between a kind of socially liberal left that believes in things like inclusion, toleration, rainbow coalition building, right? We might call the woke left if you wanted to be pejorative, right? And Jackson says, this is all important and we should sideline it, but it sometimes runs up against difficulties when it comes to aligning with the more working class movements that were once the bread and butter of the NDP, because the reality is that a lot of these workers' movements are extraordinarily progressive when it comes to economic issues, but don't necessarily adopt the same kind of standpoint when it comes to cultural issues or social issues, right? In fact, some of these groups can be pretty conservative in that vein, right?
No, for sure.
And he says, we need to find a way to reconcile these two things together. And I do think that is possible to do that. We just haven't hit the formula yet.
Yeah. No, and I mean, a lot of the sort of cultural issues that the U.S. obviously is facing, we're going out and facing it up here. But I'm just always so annoyed how the Canadian left is always overshadowed by what's going on in the States and the American left. I mean, like Panich, and guys that you talk about, obviously McPherson, and I mean, even some other great thinkers like Harold Ennis, and even conservative thinkers like George Grant. I mean, totally get overshadowed by what's going on in the US. And I mean, our, philosophical sort of bedrock here in Canada is just as strong. And I'm always disappointed that as podcasters, I mean, one of the goals, I guess, in terms of me starting my own podcast is to go out and push that narrative a bit more. So like, I'm happy to have you on and, to highlight that you are Canadian and that you draw a lot upon a lot. It's
like the beer commercial of Molson, right? I am Canadian.
But it's true though. I mean, even Panich, like Leo Panich is like a huge influence on Jacobin and Bhaskar and a lot of, left-wing thinkers in the US. And yet he never really touted it or, even just the school that you're from, York. I mean, York has been a real hub for left-wing thinking.
Yeah, Panich was there. Yeah.
Until
his death. So, no, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think that Canadian political philosophy has always operated in the shadow, not just of the United States, I should say, also Great Britain, right? So one way or another, we're always relegated to little brother status. And I do think that that's a shame in some ways, because there are distinctive issues that Canadian philosophers have brought to the fore that are of great interest, right? That usually aren't fixated upon the same way that the issues that fixate English and American scholars are, right? Just a couple of examples would be people like Charles Taylor and Will Kilmica have done a tremendous job of articulating a left liberal argument for multiculturalism, right, and explaining what that would look like, why that's foundational to the liberal tradition, and why it is that if they're actually consistent with our liberalism, we need to adopt these kind of multicultural perspectives, and also grounding that in analyses of multicultural policies in Canada, their failures and successes, right? You very rarely see work of that kind of sophistication from an American or an English audience, right? Where multiculturalism is understood in this extremely crude way, if it's thought of at all, right? Another kind of contribution that I think Canadian philosophers have made that's really quite insightful has been foregrounding the importance of Indigenous peoples to the kind of histories and the architecture of North America, right?
Well, John Ralston Saul, I mean, beautiful case in point of somebody that's been overshadowed by a lot of, stuff that goes on. I mean, I'm a big fan of his work, and he's beautifully written about that as well.
Yeah, exactly, right. And you see a lot of good work on this coming from out of the University of Victoria, in particular, people like Abigail Eisenberg, for example, right, where they point out that Indigenous philosophies and Indigenous spiritualities are unique and distinctive in their own right. They bring a kind of distinctive perspective to political issues that's sometimes lacking in Anglo or French theory. And they're trying to resurrect or articulate that to popularize these notions for new generations of philosophers, right? I don't think you see anything comparable to that occurring in the United States, let alone in the United Kingdom, right? So I'm very proud of that, and I hope that we see more of it. In fact, I should be doing more of that myself, right?
No, but I mean, I'm just so happy that we managed to keep you a little longer in Canada. I mean, we were losing you internationally for a while. I mean, I was freaking out when I'm happy that you got that international experience, but to see you come back home, I mean, as a homegrown sort of intellectual and public intellectual now, I mean, I really hope that we can manage to go out and keep you here and, give you the space to keep on doing the sort of writing that you've been doing. And I mean, because you've been plowing it out, man. It's impressive stuff that you've been doing.
Well, thanks, buddy. I really appreciate that. And look, I like Canada, right? Canada's done a lot of horrible things over the course of its history, and that we need to be more attentive to, including to Indigenous peoples and other people of color. And I think our economic system needs a lot of work, right? But, a lot of people I love and care about are here in Canada. A lot of cultural activities that I enjoy are here in Canada. I like Canadian music. I like Canadian philosophers, right? I have a kind of home team sensibility when it comes to these kind of things. And look, I'm active in Canadian politics also right now. I volunteered for the last election for the NDP. I think that I'm excited about seeing where it's going. The party is going. I'm a little concerned about the emphasis exclusively on the leader and the lack of kind of visionary policy alternatives put forward by the party, which we can talk about maybe at a later date. But I do definitely think that there's a lot of interesting things that are going on in Canada that people don't talk about. And I think it's really important that people like you are drawing attention to that or bringing attention to that from an international audience.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, even what you guys are doing, I mean, like I joked around a bit in terms of, your involvement with the Pill Pod and stuff like that. I mean, like you guys are literally the new, like kind of like Toronto communications and media folks, right? I mean, people that don't know about Ennis or Marshall McLuhan and all those thinkers that were coming up out of Toronto are fantastic thinkers. I mean, I've been much more influenced by Harold Innis because of his whole emphasis on the idea of civilization and communication. And I just think he's a really overlooked sort of thinker and philosopher in terms of, that people just don't pay attention to. People always gravitate towards McLuhan. Not that I don't have anything against McLuhan, but I mean, he's great. But I think the real genius is somebody like Harold Innis. And I have a huge, appreciation for George Grant as well. I mean, George Grant, I think, really understood what was going on in Canada and the fact that we are, I mean, living next to the United States, right? And that we are being culturally absorbed into that media ecosystem and that we need to go out and fight it off. So, what you're doing with Pills and some of the other podcasters that I see now going out there and just really railing against the sort of right-wing media that's been, flooding our airwaves. I think we really need to be touting as well, our intellectual chops in terms of, the schools, the thinkers that we currently have here and, really push it out because I think we have a lot to be proud of.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, this goes both ways, right? I think that sometimes there's a bad tendency on the part of American conservatives, right, to assume that Canadian conservatism is analogous to American
Oh
conservatism or
shit, yeah.
reducible to
Yeah.
American conservatism. And the weird thing is sometimes the Canadian left will make that error as well, right? And assuming that when they're confronting the Conservative Party of Canada, they're just confronting the Republican Party light, you know what I mean, or Republican
Yeah.
Party north. And occasionally you see flourishes of that, you know, but it's really telling that Fox News North, as it was once called, Sun News Media, kind of had a brief flash in the pan moment, and then it disappeared, right? Because that kind of American conservatism has never really been organic to this country, to use a kind of skewed metaphor, right?
Yeah.
What you see with Canadian conservatism and the kind of thing we need to confront as leftists is something quite different than what we confront in the United States, right? There are strands of high Toryism embodied by figures like Grant that it's very important to understand and to criticize, right? Especially because there's some intellectually robust defenses of them. Another important tradition is the ordered liberty tradition that comes directly from England, right? That we need to confront and we need to understand. And then, of course, in the province of Quebec, there's very peculiar kinds of French conservatism that draw a lot from the broader French tradition, but also are distinct in the way that Quebec is distinct. And a lot of people struggle to understand those, particularly American conservatives, because a lot of American conservatives are bewildered when they find out that French conservatives don't support something like the small state, for example, right? Or they support various kinds of social programs. And in order to understand that, of course, you need to know the history of French conservatism, which has always been more parochially minded and nationally minded than individualist, right? Now, on the flip side of thing, and I guess we can just end here because I have to go out. I think that what you said about McPherson in particular is really inspiring to me, because to me, McPherson has always been one of the philosophers that I most identify with in terms of arguing for a view that's broadly speaking concurrent with my own, right? I think his vision of a kind of liberal socialism or democratic liberal socialism is really the route that we should be going for. And I think this idea that what we need to do as theorists is to kind of cut the possessive individualist strains out of liberalism and keep the emancipatory core is also a very inspiring and very interesting project. And it's sad that his work kind of disappeared from the radar worldwide for a little while. Seems to be making a bit of a comeback because I see people referring to him more and more online. Now I kind of play my own part in that, I think. But I think his contribution was really seminal. And I really hope that more people take him seriously and also appreciate that he was writing in a Canadian context and drew a lot of these inspirations for social liberalism or democratic socialism liberalism from what was going on with people in the CCF or the NDP. Right. So
yeah, rock on. No, I mean that's another part of your writing now that I've seen, you know, popping up and more, and I just really appreciate that. And I mean, I'd love to have you back on to talk about that. And
sure,
I mean,
I'll always
because
chat in person.
I mean, in terms of the podcast itself, I mean, I'm really hoping to, like, I'm inspired by what Michael obviously did, and you know, in terms of a next left or a new engaged left. But I think Canada has a unique role to go out and play in all this, and that our particularities need to be identified and talked about much more. And we just have so much talent, man. I mean, there's so much stuff going on that we, you know, it just doesn't get publicized. So if I can go out and help push that narrative and, you know, obviously keep pushing your work and everybody else that's doing some amazing stuff. I mean, you know, keep it going. I'm super impressed and I'm super hopeful that, you know, by seeing, you know, a crew like you guys come up and they're really railing out there and doing some amazing work.
Well, I'll tell the others. They'll be really happy to hear that because, you know, we all, like you said, live in Toronto, you know, grew up in the country. And I know Eric and the others will appreciate the fact that, you know, you like what we're doing. Because that was one of the goals, right? To kind of give a bit of a, you know, Toronto Canadian kind of vibe on things, do things our own way, right? Not to just become another American podcast.
No doubt. And kidnap Burgess and keep him in Toronto, man.
Well, yeah.
Just tell him to give up on that project south of the border.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Super.
Well, look, it was really great talking to you, dude. And yeah, I'm happy to come by some other time, talk with person or whatever it happens to be. But, you know, keep on trucking with what you're doing. I really like it. And I really hope that it's a big success. Okay. And
I appreciate it. You too, man. Keep up
so much
work.
for all the work that you've done. And thank you so much for supporting my work from the very beginning. I really appreciate that.
It's been amazing to watch. Peace, bud. Take it easy.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.